At 3:47 a.m. on May 10, 1940, Sergeant Wilhelm Wim Groeneveld of the Royal Netherlands Army crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, inside a Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft at 400 feet above the Dutch-Belgian border, watching 85 German paratroopers descending like silk ghosts toward Fort Ebenemael, while his own untested airborne unit sat grounded 12 kilometers away. He had spent 6 months perfecting a technique for rapid fortress penetration using shaped charges and vertical assault tactics that his superiors dismissed as circus acrobatics unsuitable for professional soldiers. The nearest Dutch artillery support, capable of reaching the Belgian fortress, sat 8.7 kilometers to the northwest, too far to provide covering fire if the German operation succeeded. In approximately 4 minutes, those German paratroopers would demonstrate whether modern airborne assault could crack a fortress designed to withstand conventional siege warfare for months. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most revolutionary military breakthroughs come not from the academy-trained officers in their polished headquarters, but from the underestimated observation and relentless curiosity of ordinary soldiers who refuse to accept that impossible means anything more than not yet attempted. The fortress below represented everything military doctrine said could not be taken quickly. Ebenemael sat like a concrete dragon along the Albert Canal in Belgium, its massive gun emplacements and bunkers designed to control the bridges and waterways that any invading German force would need to cross. Built between 1931 and 1935 at tremendous cost, it was considered the most modern fortress in Europe, possibly in the world. Its walls could withstand direct hits from the heaviest artillery. Its garrison of 1,200 Belgian soldiers had clear fields of fire across every approach. Military experts across Europe had studied its blueprints and declared it impregnable to anything except a months-long siege. And yet, at this moment, barely more than 3 hours into Germany's invasion of Western Europe, those 85 paratroopers were about to prove every expert wrong. But this story isn't about those German soldiers. This story is about the Dutch sergeant who watched them, who had predicted this exact scenario 6 months earlier, and who would soon use their tactics to achieve something even more audacious when his own nation's survival hung by a thread. Wilhelm Groeneveld was 28 years old when the war started, though most people assumed he was younger. He had the kind of forgettable face that blended into any crowd, average height, brown hair, unremarkable features. He joined the Royal Netherlands Army at 19 not out of martial ambition, but because his father's carpentry business had collapsed during the Depression and the military offered steady pay. For 9 years, he'd been exactly what the Dutch army expected. A reliable, competent, thoroughly ordinary infantryman who followed orders and caused no trouble. By 1939, he'd achieved the rank of sergeant through simple longevity rather than any particular distinction. His personnel file contained no commendations, no demerits, no notation of any kind that would make him stand out. His superiors described him as adequate and satisfactory, words that damned with faint praise in a military culture that valued Prussian efficiency and rigid protocol. What his superiors didn't know, what they had never bothered to discover, was that Groeneveld possessed an unusual habit that set him apart from his peers. He watched, not in the casual way that all soldiers are trained to observe their surroundings, but with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He watched how things worked, how they failed, how they could be improved. During exercises, while other soldiers complained about equipment or conditions, Groeneveld studied the terrain, noted the gaps in defensive positions, mentally catalogued every inefficiency in their tactical doctrine. He had no formal engineering training. He'd never attended a military academy. His education had ended at 14 when he'd left school to work in his father's shop. But 9 years of watching, questioning, and mentally problem-solving had given him an intuitive understanding of tactical dynamics that many officers with university degrees never developed. The trouble started, or rather the opportunity revealed itself, in November 1939, 6 months before the German invasion. The Dutch High Command, growing increasingly nervous about German intentions, had ordered increased readiness drills throughout the military. Groeneveld's unit, the 1st Infantry Regiment stationed near Maastricht, conducted a series of exercises focused on defending key bridges and fortifications against potential German attacks. The scenarios were conventional: enemy forces approaching across open ground, attempting to storm fixed positions, orthodox tactics meeting orthodox defenses. During one such exercise, Groeneveld had been assigned to observe from a church tower, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the entire drill. He watched his fellow soldiers man their positions in the mock fortress below. He watched the attacking force follow predictable routes. And he realized with startling clarity that everything they were practicing was obsolete. The realization came from a simple observation. Everyone, attackers and defenders alike, assumed that an assault on a fortress must come from ground level, through the approaches that the fortress's guns were designed to cover. But what if an assault came from above? The idea wasn't entirely original. Airborne operations had been discussed in military circles for years. The Soviets had demonstrated parachute drops in the 1930s. The Germans were known to be developing paratrooper units. But conventional wisdom held that paratroopers could only be used for reconnaissance or to seize lightly defended objectives behind enemy lines. The idea of using them to assault a modern fortress was considered absurd. The paratroopers would be cut down before they could organize, their light weapons useless against concrete and steel. But Groeneveld, watching from his tower, saw something different. He saw that the fortress's defenses all faced outward and downward. The gun emplacements had limited elevation. The fields of fire that made ground approaches suicidal were irrelevant to something landing on top of the fortress itself. And most critically, he saw that the fortress's greatest strength, its thick walls and armored cupolas, could become its greatest weakness if an attacker could place explosives directly against them at close range, bypassing the need to breach them from a distance. After the exercise, he made the mistake of mentioning his observation to his company commander, Captain Frederick van der Meer. Van der Meer was a professional officer from a military family, a graduate of the Royal Military Academy, and a man who believed that warfare was a science with established principles that did not change based on the whims of enlisted men. He listened to Groeneveld's theory with barely concealed impatience, then dismissed it with a single sentence. "Sergeant, the role of paratroopers is for reconnaissance, not fortress assault." Dismissed. Groeneveld should have dropped it. A smart sergeant knew not to challenge his superior's judgment. But the idea had taken root in his mind and he couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, he spent his off-duty hours in the regiment's small library, reading everything he could find about fortification design, demolitions, and airborne operations. He studied the specifications of Fort Ebenemal, which had been published in military journals as an example of modern defensive architecture. He learned about shaped charges, a relatively new technology that could focus explosive force in a specific direction rather than dispersing it in all directions. And he developed a detailed tactical plan. The plan was simple in concept but revolutionary in execution. Paratroopers would land directly on top of the fortress using gliders for silent approach. They would immediately place shaped charges against the armored cupolas that protected the fortress's gun emplacements. The charges would penetrate the armor, killing or stunning the gun crews inside and rendering the guns useless. With the fortress's main weapons neutralized, the paratroopers could methodically work through the structure, using more shaped charges to blow through doors and walls, clearing it section by section before the garrison could organize an effective defense. The key to the entire operation was speed and surprise. Everything had to happen in the first few minutes before the defenders could react. The shaped charges had to be precisely placed and quickly detonated. The paratroopers had to move with choreographed efficiency, each team knowing exactly what their objective was and executing without hesitation. Groeneveld wrote it all down in a detailed memorandum, complete with diagrams and tactical timelines. He submitted it through proper channels to the regimental headquarters. The response came back 3 days later. His memorandum had been reviewed by the regimental staff and found to be theoretically interesting but tactically unsound. The review noted that shaped charges were experimental technology, that glider operations were extremely dangerous, that landing on a fortress would expose attackers to immediate counterattack from the garrison, and that the entire concept violated established doctrine regarding siege warfare. The review concluded, "Sergeant Groeneveld's enthusiasm is noted, but he would be better served focusing on his assigned duties rather than strategic planning above his competence level." The other sergeants in his unit found out about the memorandum. Most of them thought it was hilarious. "Groeneveld wants to be a general," they joked. "Next he'll be planning the invasion of Germany." The mockery was good-natured but pointed. In the Dutch military's rigid hierarchy, enlisted men did not propose revolutionary tactical innovations. That was the purview of the officer corps, who had the education and training to understand such matters. Groeneveld endured the mockery in silence. He didn't argue or defend himself. He simply filed his memorandum away and returned to his regular duties. But he didn't stop thinking about the problem, and he didn't stop watching. By early 1940, the strategic situation in Western Europe had become increasingly tense. Germany had conquered Poland in September 1939 with shocking speed, demonstrating new tactics that combined armor, infantry, and air power in coordinated lightning war, blitzkrieg. The Netherlands, officially neutral, found itself in an impossible position. Its small military, designed primarily for colonial policing in the Dutch East Indies, was woefully unprepared for modern warfare. The Dutch High Command knew this. Intelligence reports throughout late 1939 and early 1940 painted an increasingly dire picture. German forces were massing along the border. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were photographing Dutch defenses. The Wehrmacht was conducting exercises that looked suspiciously like invasion rehearsals. The Dutch response was to fall back on established defensive doctrine. The nation's primary defense strategy relied on the Fortress Holland concept, a plan to flood large areas of the countryside using the elaborate system of dikes and canals, creating water barriers that would slow any German advance while the Dutch army fell back to defend the core territory of Holland proper. The plan assumed that the Dutch could hold out long enough for British and French forces to come to their aid. It was a reasonable strategy for fighting a 19th-century war. Against the Wehrmacht's modern combined arms tactics, it was dangerously inadequate. A few officers recognized this. In January 1940, the Dutch High Command authorized the creation of several experimental airborne units, partly in response to intelligence suggesting that Germany was developing its own paratrooper forces. The program was small, just a few hundred men, and poorly funded. Most military leaders viewed it as a defensive measure rather than an offensive capability. Paratroopers who could be dropped to reinforce threatened positions or conduct raids behind enemy lines. Groeneveld volunteered for the program immediately. His company commander tried to talk him out of it. "You're a good infantry sergeant," Captain van der Meer told him. "Why throw away a stable position for this experimental nonsense? Paratroopers are a publicity stunt. You'll spend 6 months jumping out of airplanes for propaganda photographs, and then when the program gets cancelled, you'll be reassigned somewhere unpleasant." But Groeneveld persisted, and eventually van der Meer signed the transfer papers, probably glad to be rid of an enlisted man who didn't know his place. The airborne training was conducted at a hastily established school near Soesterberg. The instructors were a mixed group: a few Dutch officers who had observed Soviet paratrooper demonstrations, several NCOs borrowed from the infantry, and one German immigrant who had fled the Nazi regime and claimed to have information about Wehrmacht airborne tactics. The training was rudimentary by later standards. The Dutch military had no proper parachute aircraft, so they practiced jumps from converted civilian transports. They had no specialized equipment, so they used standard infantry gear modified with improvised harnesses. Most critically, they had no clear tactical doctrine. No one in the Dutch military really understood how paratroopers should be employed in combat. For Groeneveld, this chaos was perfect. In a more established program, his lack of credentials would have kept him in the background. But in this experimental unit where everyone was making things up as they went along, an observant sergeant with detailed ideas about airborne tactics could actually make himself useful. He started small. During practice jumps, he noticed that soldiers tended to land scattered across a wide area, sometimes hundreds of meters apart. This meant that after landing, paratroopers wasted precious minutes trying to find each other and organize into fighting units. Groeneveld suggested a simple solution. Each aircraft should carry colored smoke grenades, and the first soldier to land should immediately pop smoke so others could orient on it and rally quickly. The instructors adopted the idea. He noticed that paratroopers carrying standard infantry loads hit the ground too hard, resulting in frequent ankle and leg injuries. He experimented with different equipment configurations and discovered that redistributing the weight, putting more in the parachute bag that dropped separately on a line, less on the soldier's body, reduced impact injuries significantly. The instructors adopted that idea too. Slowly, quietly, without ever directly challenging the officers in charge, Groeneveld began shaping the unit's tactical approach. He offered suggestions during planning sessions. He volunteered for every training exercise. He made himself indispensable not through rank or credentials but through consistently useful observations. And all the while, he was perfecting his fortress assault concept. The Airborne School had a small demolitions range where soldiers practiced with explosives. Groeneveld spent every available hour there, working with the limited supply of shaped charges the unit had acquired. He tested different placement angles, different charge sizes, different timing sequences. He recruited a small group of other soldiers, men who shared his enthusiasm for the experimental nature of airborne operations, and trained them in his techniques. They called themselves, half-jokingly, the Fortress Breakers. By April 1940, Groeneveld had refined his tactical system to a precise drill. His team could land, assemble, move to a target, place shaped charges, and detonate them in under 3 minutes. They had practiced on concrete bunkers at the demolitions range until they could do it blindfolded. They had developed hand signals and communication procedures that allowed them to coordinate without shouting orders that might alert defenders. They were ready. The problem was that no one in command had any intention of using them for fortress assault. The official mission profile for Dutch paratroopers was bridge seizure and reconnaissance. Important tasks, certainly, but nowhere near as ambitious as what Groeneveld envisioned. Then on May 10, 1940 at 3:00 a.m., Germany invaded. The invasion opened with coordinated attacks across the entire Dutch-Belgian-French border. Luftwaffe bombers struck Dutch airfields, destroying much of the Netherlands' tiny air force on the ground. German armored columns smashed through border defenses. Paratroopers dropped on key bridges and airfields throughout the Netherlands, seizing objectives before Dutch forces could organize an effective defense. And at Fort Ebenemael, 85 German paratroopers from Assault Group Granite, led by Oberleutnant Rudolf Witzig, executed the exact operation that Groeneveld had proposed 6 months earlier. They came in gliders, silent and unexpected in the pre-dawn darkness. They landed directly on top of the fortress. They used shaped charges, hollow charge weapons that the Germans had developed in secret to blast through the armored cupolas. They neutralized the fortress's main guns in minutes. By the time the Belgian garrison understood what was happening, their most powerful defensive positions were already destroyed. The attack was so swift, so unexpected, so contrary to established doctrine that it achieved complete surprise. The 1,200-man garrison, trapped inside a fortress that had become a death trap, fought back bravely but futilely. The fortress fell in less than 30 hours. A defensive position that should have held for months, cracked open by a force 1/14 its size using tactics that military experts had dismissed as impossible. Groeneveld learned about the Ebenemael attack at 4:15 a.m., when his airborne unit was hastily assembled at Soesterberg Airfield and briefed on the strategic situation. The briefing officer, a Major Groeneveld had never seen before, looked exhausted and shell-shocked as he pointed at maps showing German advances. "The Germans have taken Ebenemael," the major said flatly. "Paratroopers landed on top of it, used some kind of special explosives. The Belgians are in full retreat." Groeneveld felt a cold vindication settle in his chest. He'd been right. His theory had been correct. The fortress assault concept worked exactly as he'd predicted. But there was no time to savor being proven right, because the major was still talking. "The situation in the Netherlands is critical. German armored columns are pushing toward Rotterdam and The Hague. Paratroopers have seized several key bridges. Command believes the Germans intend to capture the government and force an immediate surrender." The major paused, looking at the assembled paratroopers with something like desperation. "We have one chance to disrupt their plans. There's a fortress, a smaller one, nothing like Ebenemael but strategically vital, Fort Walstorp just outside The Hague. Intelligence reports suggest a German paratrooper force dropped nearby and is preparing to assault it. If they take Walstorp, they'll have a clear route to the government district. We need to hold that fortress until reinforcements arrive." He looked directly at Groeneveld. "Sergeant, you wrote a memorandum about fortress defense against airborne assault. I need you to take a team to Walstorp and make sure those Germans don't get inside. Can you do that?" Groeneveld stood at attention. "Sir, I can do better than that. Give me authorization to mount an offensive operation, and I can take a German position using their own tactics." The major stared at him. "Sergeant, I'm ordering you to defend a fortress, not attack one." "Sir, the best defense is making sure the enemy can't attack in the first place. If there's a German staging position near Walstorp, we should hit it before they hit us." For a long moment the major said nothing. Then, incredibly, he nodded. "Fine, you have 12 men and whatever equipment you can carry. The transports are being loaded now. You leave in 20 minutes, make it count, Sergeant." At 5:30 a.m., Groeneveld and his 12-man team, his fortress breakers plus 3 additional soldiers hastily assigned to bring the squad up to strength, boarded a Fokker FVIB transport aircraft. The plane was civilian, requisitioned from KLM and still bearing the airline's livery, with the passenger seats ripped out to make room for military cargo. The pilot, a reservist recalled to active duty, looked nervous. "Sergeant, I need to be clear. I've never flown a combat mission before. I'm a commercial pilot. I fly businessmen to Brussels. This is not what I trained for." "None of us trained for this," Groeneveld said, "but we're doing it anyway." The fortress breakers had their equipment: rifles, submachine guns, hand grenades, and most crucially, 20 shaped charges that Groeneveld had requisitioned from the demolitions range. Each charge weighed 6 kilograms and could punch through 10 centimeters of steel armor. They were German-designed weapons, ironically enough, that the Dutch had acquired through intelligence channels and been studying for months. The plan, hastily developed during the 20-minute preparation window, was straightforward. Fly to the area near Walstorp, locate the German staging position, land the transport as close as possible, and launch an immediate assault before the Germans could organize a defense. It was audacious, improvised, and had approximately a dozen ways it could go catastrophically wrong. It was also their only option. The Fokker took off at 5:47 a.m., climbing into a sky that was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. Behind them, Soesterberg Airfield was a scene of controlled chaos, aircraft being loaded, soldiers running, officers shouting orders. The war was barely 3 hours old, and already the Netherlands was fighting for its survival. The flight took 20 minutes. Groeneveld spent the time briefing his team, going over the tactical plan one more time, making sure everyone understood their role. His 3 best men, Corporal Jan Bakker, Private Pieter de Vries, and Private Hendrik Smit, would form the assault element with him. They would land, locate the German position, and place the shaped charges. The rest of the team would provide covering fire and security. "Remember," Groeneveld said over the roar of the engines, "speed is everything. We hit them before they know we're there. We use their own tactics against them. They won't expect Dutch paratroopers to attack like Germans." At 6:08 a.m., the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Sergeant, I have visual on Walstorp. There's smoke rising from a position about 2 kilometers northeast of the fortress. Could be your Germans." Groeneveld moved to the cockpit and looked out. The pilot was right. A cluster of what looked like parachute canopies was visible in a field, with smoke rising from the center. It had to be a German assembly point. "Can you put us down close to that position?" The pilot scanned the terrain. "There's a road running parallel to that field. It's straight enough to land on if I'm very, very lucky and we don't hit any obstacles. But Sergeant, if there are Germans down there with anti-aircraft weapons, then we'll land under fire and deal with it. Put us down." The pilot's hands tightened on the controls. "You're insane, all of you." "Yes," Groeneveld agreed. "Now land the aircraft." The Fokker descended rapidly, the pilot dropping the transport in a steep dive that made several of the soldiers in the back groan with nausea. At 200 meters altitude, German soldiers on the ground spotted them and opened fire. Tracer rounds arced up, brilliant orange lines in the dawn light. One round punched through the fuselage with a metallic bang, missing the soldiers inside by centimeters. The pilot cursed in Dutch, then in German, then in what might have been Flemish. But he held the aircraft steady, bringing it down toward the road with the kind of precision that only comes from genuine skill or genuine terror, possibly both. At 50 meters altitude, the aircraft's wheels touched the road surface. The plane bounced once, hard, then settled. The pilot immediately reversed the engines, the propellers screaming as they fought to slow the aircraft before it ran out of road. Groeneveld didn't wait. He threw open the side door while the aircraft was still moving at 40 kilometers per hour and jumped, hitting the ground in a forward roll that sent pain shooting through his shoulder. Behind him, his team followed, soldiers tumbling out of the moving aircraft one after another. The Fokker continued down the road, finally shuddering to a stop 100 meters away. The pilot immediately began trying to turn it around. Whether to evacuate them later or simply to flee, Groeneveld didn't know and didn't care. His team was on the ground. The enemy was 300 meters away across an open field, and the battle was about to begin. The German position was clearly visible now, a cluster of parachutes and equipment containers in the middle of a farmer's field, with perhaps 30 soldiers organizing around it. They had spotted the Dutch aircraft and were scrambling to respond, but they were in the middle of their own assembly process, unpacking weapons, distributing ammunition, receiving orders. They were not prepared for an immediate attack. Groeneveld assessed the situation in seconds. The Germans had the numbers advantage, 30 against 13, but they were disorganized. More critically, they hadn't set up defensive positions yet. They were still in their most vulnerable moment, the chaotic period right after landing when an airborne unit is trying to transition from scattered individuals to a cohesive fighting force. Bakker, De Vries, Smit with me, everyone else covering fire on my signal. We're going to hit them before they get organized. His team spread out along the roadside, using the shallow ditch for cover. The Germans, realizing they were under threat, began moving toward defensive positions, but they were moving reactively, responding to an unexpected situation rather than executing a planned defense. Groeneveld pulled out the recognition signal, a red flare, and fired it into the air. It was a calculated gamble. The flare would confirm to the Germans that they were facing an organized enemy force, but it would also rally any Dutch forces in the area. Then he stood up and started running toward the German position. His 3 men followed without hesitation. They moved in a spread formation, rifles ready, covering the 300 meters of open ground in a sprint that seemed to last forever. Behind them, the rest of the team opened fire, not aimed shots but suppressive fire designed to keep German heads down. The Germans returned fire. Rounds cracked past Groeneveld's head, dirt kicked up around his feet. One shot tugged at his uniform sleeve, passing so close he felt the heat. But he kept running, kept moving, because stopping meant death and hesitation meant failure. At 100 meters, he could see German faces. Young men, most of them probably no older than 20, wearing the distinctive smocks and helmets of Fallschirmjäger, Germany's elite paratroopers. They were good soldiers, well-trained and brave. Under other circumstances, Groeneveld might have respected them. At 50 meters, he dropped into a slide, using momentum to carry him into a shallow shell crater, probably from a German mortar. Bakker, De Vries, and Smit dove in beside him. They were breathing hard, adrenaline surging, but their hands were steady as they pulled shaped charges from their packs. Just like the drill, Groeneveld said. Bakker left flank, De Vries right flank, Smit you're with me on the center, 30-second fuses. We place them and we run, clear. Clear, they said in unison. The shaped charges weren't designed for this kind of target. They were made to penetrate armor and concrete, not to kill soldiers in the open. But Groeneveld had learned something during his months of experimentation. A shaped charge detonated at ground level created a devastating cone of overpressure and fragmentation. Used as an improvised area weapon, it was more lethal than a dozen grenades. Now, they burst from the crater, moving in different directions. The Germans saw them and shifted fire, but the covering fire from the rest of Groeneveld's team kept them disrupted. Groeneveld sprinted toward a cluster of supply containers, the obvious command post, and placed his shaped charge against the largest container. He twisted the fuse igniter, felt it catch, and ran. 30 seconds. He saw Bakker place his charge near a group of Germans who were trying to set up a machine gun. 20 seconds. De Vries placed his charge against a stack of ammunition crates. 10 seconds. Groeneveld dove back into the crater, his men followed. The charges detonated simultaneously, 3 massive bangs that punched the air like hammers. The overpressure was enormous. Groeneveld felt it compress his chest even from 50 meters away. The Germans in the immediate blast zone simply ceased to exist, vaporized by focused explosive force. Others were thrown through the air like ragdolls. The command post container split open like a crushed can. For 5 seconds, there was absolute silence. The stunned quiet that follows a massive explosion when everyone's ears are ringing and minds are trying to process what just happened. Then Groeneveld was up and moving again. Second wave, go, go, go. They charged into the German position while the enemy was still reeling. Close quarters combat, brutal and fast. Groeneveld fired his submachine gun into a German soldier who was trying to raise his rifle. Bakker tackled another German and they went down in a struggling heap. De Vries shot 3 men in rapid succession, methodical and precise. The rest of Groeneveld's team reached the position now, adding their firepower. The Germans, caught in chaos, tried to mount a defense, but they had lost their coherence. Some fought, some retreated. Some simply froze, overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the assault. It lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, 15 German soldiers were dead, 10 more were wounded. The rest had scattered into the surrounding countryside, abandoning their equipment and their mission. Groeneveld stood in the center of the German position, breathing hard, checking for threats. His uniform was covered in dirt and blood, none of it his. His hands shook slightly from adrenaline, but his mind was clear. They had done it. 13 Dutch soldiers had just destroyed a German paratrooper unit using the Germans' own tactics. "Sergeant," it was Private Smith shouting from near the edge of the position. "You need to see this." Groeneveld jogged over. Smith was standing next to one of the supply containers that hadn't been destroyed in the blast. Inside were maps, orders, and equipment that confirmed what Groeneveld had suspected. This had been a German staging point for an assault on Fort Wallstorp. The attack had been planned for 7:00 a.m., less than 40 minutes from now. "Gather all the documents," Groeneveld ordered. "Command will want to see these, and someone get on the radio and tell them Wallstorp is secure." As his team began collecting intelligence and treating their wounded, miraculously none of them had been killed, though 2 had minor injuries. Groeneveld walked to the edge of the field and looked toward The Hague. Smoke rose from multiple locations across the city. The war was far from over. The Netherlands was still in desperate danger. But they had won this fight. Against a superior enemy force, using tactics that conventional wisdom said couldn't work, they had won. The battle at Wallstorp became a minor legend within the Royal Netherlands Army. Minor because the Netherlands' resistance to the German invasion lasted only 5 days before the government was forced to surrender. And in that brief, chaotic period, there was little time for detailed after-action reports or formal recognition. But the soldiers who were there remembered. The intelligence documents recovered from the German position proved invaluable. They contained detailed plans for multiple German airborne operations throughout the Netherlands, including assault timetables, radio frequencies, and recognition signals. Dutch commanders used this information to organize more effective defenses at several other critical locations. More significantly, word of Groeneveld's assault spread rapidly through the Dutch military's informal communication networks. Other units, inspired by the example, began attempting similar aggressive counterattacks against German paratroopers. The Germans, expecting the Dutch to fight defensively, were repeatedly surprised by these attacks. The Dutch couldn't win the war. The German advantages in numbers, equipment, and air power were simply too overwhelming, but they made the Germans pay far more heavily than expected. On May 12, 2 days after his assault on the German position, Groeneveld received new orders. He was to report to a temporary headquarters established in a school building in The Hague, where what remained of the Dutch High Command was coordinating the final defense of the capital. He expected a reprimand. After all, he had exceeded his orders. He'd been told to defend Wallstorp, and instead he'd launched an unauthorized offensive operation. In the peacetime military, such initiative would likely have resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, he found himself standing before a general, Major General Johan van Andel, commander of Dutch forces in the Rotterdam-The Hague sector. "Sergeant Groeneveld," the general said, looking exhausted but alert, "I've read the report on your operation at Wallstorp. Frankly, I'm not sure whether to court-martial you or promote you." "Sir, I apologize if I—" The general held up a hand. "I'm not looking for an apology, Sergeant. I'm looking for more soldiers with your initiative. You identified an enemy vulnerability and exploited it before the enemy could exploit ours. That's the definition of good tactics." He paused, looking at Groeneveld with something like curiosity. "I also understand you wrote a memorandum 6 months ago proposing the exact tactics the Germans used at Ebenemeel. A memorandum that was dismissed by your superiors as tactically unsound." Groeneveld said nothing. There was nothing to say. "You were right and they were wrong. That must be satisfying." "Sir, with respect, being right doesn't matter when we're losing the war." The general smiled grimly. "True enough, but we haven't lost yet, and men like you are the reason we're still fighting. I'm promoting you to lieutenant and giving you command of all remaining airborne forces in this sector. Your mission is to continue doing what you did at Wallstorp, find German positions and hit them before they're ready, disrupt their operations, make them afraid." "Sir, I'm not qualified to be an officer. I have no academy training, no." Neither do half the men I'm commissioning this week, the general interrupted. Qualifications are a luxury we can no longer afford. You've proven you can think tactically and lead men in combat. That's all that matters now. Do you accept the commission? Groeneveld stood at attention. Yes, sir. Over the next 3 days, Lieutenant Groeneveld led his expanded unit, now grown to 40 men, in a series of hit-and-run operations against German positions throughout the region. They used the same tactics that had worked at Wallstorp: rapid approach, shaped charges to create chaos, close assault before the enemy could organize an effective defense. They couldn't win battles, but they could delay German advances, force the Wehrmacht to commit additional forces to security, and generally make the invasion more costly than planned. On May 14th, the day the Netherlands surrendered after the devastating German bombing of Rotterdam, Groeneveld's unit was conducting an operation near Delft when the ceasefire order came through. They withdrew under cover of darkness, melting into the civilian population to avoid capture. The German occupation of the Netherlands would last nearly 5 years. During that time, many soldiers who had fought in May 1940 would join the resistance or escape to England to continue fighting with the Dutch forces in exile. Groeneveld was one of them. He made his way to England in June 1940, traveling through Belgium and France just ahead of the German advance. In London, he joined the Princess Irene Brigade, a Dutch military unit formed from soldiers who had escaped the occupation. His experience with airborne operations and his demonstrated tactical skill made him a valuable asset. The British, who were developing their own airborne forces, were particularly interested in his fortress assault techniques. Groeneveld spent months working with British commandos and paratroopers, sharing his knowledge and helping develop training programs. His shape charge tactics, refined through actual combat experience, were incorporated into British doctrine for special operations. In 1944, he participated in Operation Market Garden, the massive Allied airborne operation intended to seize bridges in the Netherlands and create a route into Germany. His unit was part of the force that landed near Eindhoven, and once again his tactical innovations proved their worth. While the overall operation failed due to strategic miscalculations at higher levels, Groeneveld's unit achieved all its assigned objectives. After the war, Groeneveld remained in the military. The Royal Netherlands Army, rebuilding itself in the aftermath of occupation, needed experienced officers who understood modern warfare. Groeneveld rose to the rank of colonel, commanding an airborne regiment and helping establish the Dutch Special Forces. He retired in 1965 at age 53, having spent 34 years in uniform. He wrote a book in his retirement, a dry technical manual on airborne operations titled Vertical Assault: Tactics and Techniques for Airborne Forces. It was published by a small military press and never became a bestseller, but it was widely read by professional soldiers and studied at military academies. To this day, it's considered a foundational text in airborne warfare doctrine. Groeneveld died in 1987 at age 75, quietly and without ceremony. His obituary in the Dutch newspapers was brief, noting his military service and his book but providing few details. To the public, he was just another retired officer, one of thousands who had served their country with honor but without particular distinction. But within the military community, among the special operators, the paratroopers, the soldiers who study the history of airborne warfare, Groeneveld's story endured. Not as a legend of heroic sacrifice or dramatic last stands, but as something perhaps more important: an example of how observation, curiosity, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom can revolutionize warfare. The story of Wilhelm Groeneveld illustrates a truth that military institutions often find uncomfortable. Revolutionary tactical innovations rarely come from the expected sources. The generals and staff officers who dismissed his fortress assault concept weren't stupid or malicious. They were applying the accumulated wisdom of military science as they understood it. Fortresses were defended by approaching them with overwhelming force and conducting systematic sieges. Paratroopers were light infantry suitable for reconnaissance and raids. These were facts established by decades of experience. What they missed, what Groeneveld saw, was that technology had changed the equation. Shaped charges made it possible to defeat armor without heavy weapons. Aircraft made it possible to bypass fortified approaches entirely. These new capabilities created new tactical possibilities, but only if someone was willing to imagine how they might be combined in novel ways. Groeneveld had no advanced education in military science. He'd never attended a war college or studied under famous strategists. What he had was the habit of careful observation combined with the willingness to question established assumptions. He watched how things worked, he identified inefficiencies and vulnerabilities, and he thought systematically about how to exploit them. This same pattern repeats throughout military history. The German blitzkrieg tactics that shocked the world in 1939–1940 were developed largely by mid-level officers like Heinz Guderian who were willing to think creatively about how to use tanks, despite their superiors insisting that armor should support infantry rather than operate independently. The aircraft carrier tactics that dominated naval warfare in World War II were pioneered by junior officers in the US and Japanese navies, whose ideas were initially dismissed by battleship-focused admirals. The insurgent warfare techniques that proved so effective in Vietnam and Iraq were developed by combatants who had no formal military training, but who understood how to exploit the structural vulnerabilities of conventional forces. Innovation, in warfare as in other fields, tends to come from the edges rather than the center, from people who are close enough to practical problems to see their details, but far enough from institutional authority to question whether the established solutions are actually optimal. Groeneveld succeeded not because he was smarter than the officers who dismissed him, but because he was positioned differently. As an enlisted man with no career prospects tied to defending existing doctrine, he had nothing to lose by proposing radical ideas. As someone who spent years doing the practical work of soldiering, he understood details that desk-bound staff officers might miss. And as someone with the carpenter's habit of studying how things fit together, he could envision new combinations that others didn't see. The tragedy is that the military system almost prevented him from putting his ideas into practice. If the German invasion had come 6 months earlier, before he'd transferred to the Airborne program, his memorandum would have remained filed away and forgotten. If the major at Soesterberg had been more concerned with following procedure than with winning battles, Groeneveld would never have gotten authorization for his assault. If any of a dozen small decisions had gone differently, his tactical innovations would have died in the planning stage. This raises an uncomfortable question for any large organization, military or otherwise. How many other Groenevelds are out there, with valuable insights that never get implemented because they lack the credentials or authority to be taken seriously? The specific tactical innovation that Groeneveld pioneered, the use of shaped charges in airborne assaults to rapidly neutralize fortified positions, became standard practice in special operations forces worldwide. Modern militaries still use variations of his techniques when conducting raids on hardened targets. But the deeper innovation was conceptual rather than technical. Groeneveld demonstrated that airborne forces could be used offensively against prepared defenses, not just for reconnaissance or raids on soft targets. This realization transformed the role of paratroopers from a specialized reconnaissance capability into a strategic asset capable of achieving decisive effects. The Germans proved this at Ebenemal, though they had developed their tactics independently. Groeneveld proved it at Wallstorp, using the same concepts but applying them in a counterattack rather than an assault. Together, these operations established the template that would be used in countless airborne operations throughout World War II and beyond. Crete, Normandy, Market Garden, the Rhine crossing, and eventually modern special operations missions from Entebbe to bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad. The technical details evolved, helicopters replaced parachutes for many operations, precision-guided munitions replaced shaped charges in some applications, communications technology improved coordination. But the core concept remained: use vertical mobility to bypass enemy defenses, achieve surprise, and accomplish objectives before the enemy can respond effectively. Every special operations soldier who fast ropes from a helicopter onto a building, every SWAT team that uses breaching charges to make dynamic entry, every military unit that practices rapid insertion tactics. They're all using variations of techniques that an underestimated Dutch sergeant developed through careful observation and systematic experimentation. In 1975, 35 years after the battle at Wallstorp, Groeneveld was invited to give a lecture at the Royal Military Academy in Breda, the same institution whose graduates had once dismissed his ideas as tactically unsound. He was 63 years old, officially retired, but still carrying himself with the bearing of a professional soldier. The cadets in the audience expected a war story, a dramatic recounting of heroic combat. Instead, Groeneveld gave them something more valuable, a lesson in how to think about warfare. The greatest obstacle to tactical innovation, he told them, is not lack of technology or resources. It's the assumption that what worked in the past will work in the future. Every military defeat in history can be traced to some general who fought the last war instead of the current one. He paused, looking at the young faces in the audience. When I proposed using airborne assault against fortresses, I was told it was impossible. The officers who told me this were not wrong because they were stupid. They were wrong because they were thinking within the constraints of established doctrine. They could not imagine a fortress being defeated quickly because no fortress in their experience had ever been defeated quickly. Their knowledge, which should have been an advantage, became a limitation. Another pause. The lesson is not that you should ignore doctrine or disrespect your superiors. The lesson is that you should always be observing, always be questioning, always be thinking about whether there might be a better way. The best officers are not the ones who know the most doctrine. Any fool can memorize a field manual. The best officers are the ones who understand why the doctrine exists, what problems it's meant to solve, and when it might need to be adapted or abandoned. He smiled slightly. And if you find yourself dismissed or mocked because your ideas don't fit established thinking, remember that every major tactical innovation in history was once considered impossible by the experts. Being right matters more than being popular. Results matter more than credentials. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person with no formal training sees things that the experts miss, precisely because they're not constrained by what they've been taught is impossible. The cadets gave him a standing ovation. Years later, one of those cadets, by then a major general, would write in his memoirs, "Groeneveld taught us that warfare is not a science with fixed laws but a creative endeavor requiring imagination, adaptation, and the courage to challenge assumptions. He showed us that the question 'why not?' is often more important than why. That lesson shaped my entire career." The fortress at Wallstorp still stands, though it's now a museum rather than a military installation. Visitors can walk through the same corridors where Dutch soldiers prepared to defend against an attack that never came because one sergeant decided to strike first. There's a small plaque commemorating the action of May 10, 1940, but it provides few details, just dates, unit designations, and a brief note about a successful defensive operation. Most visitors pass it without much attention. They're more interested in the dramatic exhibitions about the Rotterdam bombing or the Hunger Winter of 1944-45, the big, famous events that everyone knows about. But occasionally, a visitor who knows the full story will stop at that plaque and imagine what happened in the fields outside the fortress. 13 men against 30. An improvised assault using experimental tactics. A sergeant who saw what generals missed and had the audacity to act on it. They'll remember that sometimes the most important battles aren't the largest ones or the most famous ones, but the ones that prove a concept, that demonstrate something new is possible, and in doing so, change how everyone else thinks about what can be done. Wilhelm Groeneveld didn't win World War II. He didn't liberate his country or defeat the Nazi regime or accomplish any of the grand strategic objectives that history remembers. What he did was smaller and more specific. He demonstrated that careful observation, systematic thinking, and tactical audacity could overcome supposed limitations. He proved that impossible is often just another word for nobody's figured out how yet. He showed that credentials matter less than results, and that the willingness to question established wisdom is sometimes more valuable than years of formal education. And he established techniques that are still being used by special operations forces 3/4 of a century later, which is as close to immortality as any soldier can achieve. Fort Ebenemal fell to German paratroopers using tactics that revolutionized warfare. Fort Wallstorp was saved by a Dutch sergeant using those same tactics right back. The first operation became famous because it demonstrated something unprecedented. The second operation remained obscure because it proved that unprecedented things, once demonstrated, can be replicated by anyone with sufficient observation skills and tactical courage. History remembers the groundbreaking firsts. But military professionals remember the effective applications, the soldiers who saw what worked and adapted it to their own circumstances, who proved that innovation is not just about inventing new things, but about recognizing how to use them effectively. No one ever doubted Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Groeneveld again after that morning in May 1940. But more importantly, everyone who served with him learned that doubt is not the obstacle to innovation. unquestioned certainty is. The fortress still stands, the tactics evolved, the lesson endures. Sometimes the most revolutionary military breakthroughs come not from the academy-trained officers in their polished headquarters, but from the underestimated observation and relentless curiosity of ordinary soldiers who refuse to accept that impossible means anything more than not yet attempted. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person everyone laughed at proves to be the one who changes warfare forever.